everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Page Turners Plus. Today, we have the honor of reflecting on Unburnable by Marie-Elena John. To tell you a bit more about Marie-Elena and her novel, we have Kesua.
Thank you, Roger. Marie-Elena John stands out as one of the most compelling contemporary voices from the Caribbean, weaving together literature, activism, and her own global development work with remarkable depth. Born and raised in Antigua to Dominican parents, she's worked as a development and human rights specialist across Africa, and that shows in her novel. Her literary debut, Unburnable, came out in 2006 and was praised at the time for its lyrical prose and its exploration of Caribbean history. Our panelist Paula described it as meeting a new star in the Caribbean literature galaxy and established Elena John as a significant literary figure.
Thank you, Kesua. So, I guess we could start with the story itself. So, it has been described as a love story. Is it?
Maybe we should let Kesawa answer that since that's kind of her purview, right?
I mean, I think it's a story about love. I think it talks about love in its in lots of interesting ways. Love is at the center of the story. It's about a mother's love for her child. It's about a stepmother's love for her adoptive child. It's about a love kind of that transcends the normal boundaries of relationships. That's a friendship. That's also a love story. Um, yeah, and the ways that love can kind of break people, I think, as well. So I do think it is a love story, but perhaps not in the sense of a rom com and a happy ever after.
I definitely agree
it's
there.
not a romance novel, if that's what we are looking for as the answer to that question. So I would adopt Kesso's answer. Um, to me, you had to dig a little deep to find the solid love theme. But yes, it's about relationships, for sure. I never got a sense, to be honest, of any deep love going on between anybody. Um, I got a sense of practical relationships. Um, Everybody trying to work out their own issues. But um, let me go back to what I said. I'll adopt Kesso's answer.
Yeah, I agree with Kesawa, but I have a quibble with what you said, Tony, about not seeing any deep love. I feel like even though it took him over 20 years to realize it, Teddy loved Lillian deeply. Um, in terms of non-romantic deep love, Silma, I don't know if that's the correct way to pronounce it, deeply loved Lillian. I think we can tell that from her actions. But yeah, it's not a love story in the romance sense at all, for sure.
Yeah, I wouldn't come back and defend my position, Francine. I would compromise. But, Teddy and Lillian certainly started out as being very lustful on his part. That's for sure. And she seemed somebody who had her barriers to love because of her experience, because of what she was trying to deal with. So the connection never really took place, maybe until much later on, and that's why I'll compromise, Francine, because much later on, yes, you can see demonstrations of Teddy's maybe rethinking the physical side of his attraction and now trying to understand who Lillian was and then realizing, yeah, I love this woman. So yes, I'll go for that.
And then, was it
Can I
maturity on? Oh, go ahead.
jump in on this? Um, I want to come back to the question of Lillian and Teddy because I think the way that Lillian is an uncomfortable presence in Teddy's marriage suggests that there is always a kind of deep love there that they both refuse to acknowledge. Teddy because he doesn't get the relationship from her that he wants, and Lillian because she's unable to express because of her own trauma her feelings in a way that means that they're able to have what they would consider each of them, I think, a normal relationship. Um, but I think that's about trauma. I don't think it's a lack of love. So I do think there is a deep love from them that is a long lasting one.
But then Teddy was a bit of a, I don't want to call him an upstart, but I don't know. He, like, when he was younger, definitely he was annoying. That's the nicest way I could put it, as it was relayed in the novel. And perhaps that was a barrier to them, like, actualizing and realizing their full potential in their relationship. And as we learn later on, Teddy always had a soft side for Lillian, right? But I suppose his own trying to rise through the ranks of academia, etc. And I'm sure Kesu maybe could attest to this, or if we had Eric on the panel as well. But it's just, I think Teddy got very distracted by career, and that was the death knell for that relationship, to be quite honest.
I think if you were going to read that generously, and you don't have to, but if one was to read it generously, we might think of him as a social climber, and he's very obsessed with his own status. And at some point, she comments on like every woman he's ever dated has helped him get somewhere. And so she's unable, as a migrant that he first meets, to get him anywhere. So she's not really of interest in. Plus, she's hard work and has all this trauma, right? So that relationship, but in his later years, where he's accomplished the things in his career that he wants to have accomplished, and he's a bit older and wiser, for lack of a better, yeah, I think that's also part of it, right? He's kind of also a bit chilled, perhaps because he's accomplished those things. He's now ready to put in the work that is required to have anything like the kind of, or to explore that emotional connection more fully.
And well, we spent a lot of time talking about Teddy. Is Lillian the protagonist of the story? I, I say yes, but there's a part of me that thinks no as well. I mean, I wouldn't say she was the only protagonist, because her story was central, but there were other important stories that were taking place
But
in different periods.
I think Matilda was definitely a strong competitor for that position, and maybe that's where the genesis of the question came from. That I don't know who put the question up, but maybe they were thinking that hold on here. Matilda certainly was a central, very central part of the novel throughout. Um, and while it was obvious that Lillian, the novel was about maybe Lillian trying to unravel her issues, um, but the way it read to me, um, I certainly was very interested in Matilda's story, and that's what drew me even more than Lillian, to be honest. Um, so take what you want from that.
I think part of the reason it looks like Lillian's not the central character is because we often see her through the eyes of other people. And that vision is typically of like a traumatized, closed off person. And so she's not interested. No one's interested in a person that like is very hard to reach. And so I think it can feel like Matilda or maybe even Iris, I would argue, is really at the center of the novel. But actually, they're only interesting because they torment Lillian. So I think Lillian is very much the center of the novel.
But then the novel takes an, well, I suppose, novel approach back in 2006 when it was published, because here we have someone who's dealing with her demons, if I could call them that, dealing with trauma, but we're getting it through the lens of what, three generations, and that's not something that we do often in the Caribbean, where we try to trace the source of our trauma, and we just think, okay, this person is facing all these social issues, they're depressed, all the trauma resides with them, as opposed to trauma being passed down or inherited. And I think I think that's what Marie-Elena was trying to demonstrate here, that some of our trauma is just inherited. We can't escape it.
I I think that she is trying to make that argument, but I don't think she does it well. I don't think Marie-Elena John is sorry, that's the author. I don't think the character, Lillian, is necessarily dealing with inherited trauma. I think she's suffering from PTSD. As a non-psychologist, not qualified to diagnose anybody with anything, right? But I don't think she gets the mental health sort of stuff right. Because we see that Lillian has experienced, like, she's adopted kind of a forced adoption at the kind of a tender age, but she sort of vaguely remembers it. She then has like her new mother who loves her dearly, um, protecting her from the truth of her ancestry, because she believes it will cause her damage. And then she finds it out and it does her untold damage anyway. But it's the shock of that moment that creates everything that comes after. Up until that point, she's a relatively mentally stable and well child. We don't get the sense that prior to her discovery of her ancestry, that everything is not relatively hunky dory, right? It's that, and that means that it's not so much something that's kind of ongoing and a problem. It's just it's a shock response. It's PTSD that she has, and everything that comes out. And also, there's the big. It's not just the big reveal. It's her life changes that come with it, right? It's a forced migration. It's to move into a new place, and all of this. This is a that's traumatic. That's not inherited. That's a result of finding out a thing. Do you see what I mean? So I think she's mixing up things, if you like. I repeat, with my non-professional historian, not psychology diagnosis.
The author is certainly trying to send that message of PTSD, you call it, um, in reference to Lillian. And I'm going to show you one example of that in her lovemaking, the sort of thing that she satisfied her, right? So, in other people's minds, and I'm not going to let on to whether I think that's normal or not, but the author certainly was trying to make the point that this is why you had to have this rough sex, because she has a problem she's dealing with. That's the connection the author was trying to make. So certainly, Keswa, she was very traumatized, and it seemed to have been from the word go. So I'm not sure if I'm getting that point where you said it's not until later on when she starts to try to discover ancestry. It seems as if that I seem to remember one point where I think Teddy is thinking that it's even in her DNA. I can't remember what part of the book that was being articulated, but I
I
think
think
she's
she
dealing with
said
the trauma for a long time. This is the point I'm trying to make.
but but all of the trauma. I don't disagree with you. I think you're right. Like, she's making that connect. The author makes that connection, but all of that happens after the trauma was originally occurred. So it's not. That's what I mean. I say it's not an inherited thing. That trauma that creates that response is not inherited. That's just a fact. It's a series of things that happened in her own life. It's not about what happened in the past. It's her response to finding that thing out. And so it's not as if, but she diagnosed it. I think it's her, not Teddy, who says, it's just in my family. It's like this. I think she's thinking to herself. But that's what I mean when I say I think. But maybe the author is getting us to see that actually it's a thin line between what's inherited and what is traumatic in our own time. Some things there's connections between them. It maybe isn't as clean as I'm suggesting either. Maybe that's what the author wants us to get.
Right, that's actually what I was going to suggest, that, it's not just the one thing or the other thing, but the two things are kind of intertwined. And yes, she had this shocking stuff happen to her, but, finding out what she found out was stuff about the trauma of her ancestors. And so, yeah, these things are linked and intertwined, and, almost a chicken and egg situation, like what caused what exactly to lead her to where she was.
And then we got glimpses of, and I suppose Kesua saw these glimpses of where she was trying to fill in the gaps in the history, like Antoine of Gaumier. And this novel asks big questions about the constructions of history, the limitations of the archive, and dependence on oral history accounts, and the politics of accessing oral sources. So, well, I have to ask Kesu as the historian, did you get a sense of those stakes? And for the non historians among us on the panel, did you also get that? Well, I would say, like, I actually didn't get that in my reading Kesu. I mean, there was a point where she was trying to look at the court transcripts, and then someone said, "Oh, you just would get like the judge's notes or something." And I didn't find that to be out of out of the norm for the time period. So I didn't really get that, but Kesu obviously saw something that we didn't.
I think it's really exciting what she's doing. Sort of 20 years really before colleagues now that I work with grapple with these same questions about the value of the archive, the implications of the archive, the limitations of it. Elena Marie John gives us this story. Marie-Elena John, sorry, gives us this story where the characters are hoping to right an injustice of the past that they believe has occurred, but can they access the documentation, or has it all been disappeared? Is it unable to access? In this story, a hurricane has destroyed the archive. There's no written evidence that they can rely on to revisit the evidence that they hope will equip Lynn's grandmother. They have to use oral sources, but can they access oral sources? Are they willing to speak to the characters? All of these kind of questions that they're raising through this investigation is really early. Like historians now grapple with really tackling these questions. So that she wrote a novel about this 20 whole years ago, for me is incredibly impressive and exciting.
And then she gives us another dimension of capturing or telling history, because we get that carnival scene where a member of the Dominican elite and a colonial officer, I think it was, were rattling on about the impacts of or the influences of African history in Dominican culture, and they were going on about masks, etc. And it just made me think of how it depends on who tells your history. I mean, the history they gave might have been very accurate, but there must have been like colonial influences in the way that they described the masks. And the I think the her name was Cecile. She was quite disparaging about the mask, and she was like, "Oh, how can he breathe in this mask?" And then the colonial officer, um, who seemingly had some appreciation for the culture, I mean, regardless of his colonial status, corrected her. But that just goes on to something that we've made time and time again on Page Turners Plus in terms of who tells our history and who records it. Because I got the impression that the people in the streets participating in the festivities were maybe not completely oblivious to the history behind the costumes that they were wearing, but they just didn't consider it. They were just wearing these costumes. And then that brings me also to another carnival point, because last month we discussed Is Just a Movie by Earl Lovelace, and carnival is a central theme to Lovelace's work. We see it also in Wine of Astonishment, The Dragon Can't Dance. So, how does the way that Marie-Elena John treats carnival in Unburnable compare to Earl Lovelace's treatment of carnival in Is Just a Movie, or any other books by Earl Lovelace?
So for me, the thing that I noticed, and which was also pointed out in the book, was that at the time they were the events they were describing in the guess it would have been the 1950s. It was not actually carnival, right? It was masquerade, because there was a comment about the fact that later on it stopped being masquerade, and that's when it became carnival, and that's when they saw the influence of carnival that was more like the Trinidad carnival. So for me, there were two different type of celebrations that had obviously the same history, the same roots, but I'm not sure that we could actually make a comparison to how the two things are described, because to me they were different. There were two different celebrations. Like, Trinidad has its carnival. What they were in Dominica, it was completely different, and I feel like Lovelace was talking more about what was going on with the working class. It was more rootsy, so to speak. Whereas in the beginning, what was being described in Unburnable was more of what the middle and upper class people were doing with their masquerades and their bands and that sort of thing. That was my takeaway from that.
That's also my takeaway, and in terms of how, because in Lovelace's description in Is Just a Movie and Wine of Astonishment, the characters he's talking about are part of the festivities, whereas in this case we saw people on a balcony in a very sort of elitist way looking over and describing it. And as you mentioned, it seemed like it was a very elitist activity, and perhaps that was just what these people in this part of town did, where where this was their their muse, if you want to call it that, and they focused on that. So I did pick up that different.
And I don't know if you noticed, but she actually described two different social classes, in fact. She talked about the masquerade where it was the more middle class, upper class people, and the men would wear their women's nightgown, and then the women would wear the husband's suit, and that was masquerade. But then, in opposition to that, there was the what you call the bond movie, which was basically the ones who were given trouble and did their own thing. Masquerade wasn't allowed to go out until 6 o'clock, but they just did whatever they want, and that was when you had the fights breaking out. So there were really like two different aspects to these celebrations in Dominica, and I think she outlined that pretty well, which I think was different to what we see in Lovelace's books.
Yeah, I feel like Lovelace is much more interested from it's just a movie anyway, in the kind of liberatory possibilities of carnival as a participant. Whereas this was much more interested in kind of the social history of carnival, the description of the different ways and the different bands. The band Mauvais actually reminded me a lot of Carnival in Martinique, where it's still very much people chanting its drums, and that's and it's very chaotic actually comparison to, like, if you compare it to another carnival like Trinidad's, where there's a big kind of financial investment and cost and project management going on before the day, so that the day runs smoothly for the revelers and the people around.
It reminded me a lot of Carnival in Grenada, where you have the pretty mass, the bands, but there's still, especially in the rural areas, there's still a lot of the traditional mass, which is literally, there are different types of them, but there are literally bands of people going around chanting with specific chants that still exists in Grenada. So yeah, I really thought about that a lot when she was describing the Bond movie. I was thinking, oh, this is like Shortney or the Vieux Carre. There's things that you see in Grenada as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the jab jab you're talking about as well in Grenada. But I think, Loveless in it's just a movie is just a movie. Speaks about the indigenous Trinidadian carnival. It's got a lot of elements that connect certainly to the genesis, the African genesis of a lot of what was going on. But to me, Lovelace comes description in that novel comes across more as what carnival has evolved to, the Caribbean carnival, the true indigenous Caribbean carnival. Whereas Grenada, Dominica, they have held on to this the real. They haven't evolved too much in that sense. It's more of the African influence. So I'm saying that surely Carnival in Trinidad is heavily African influence as well, but because of the cultural melting pot, you've got the other elements and your homegrown Caribbean thing. Whereas in Dominica, you didn't get the homegrown Dominican essence of Carnival. That's how I kind of got that. Um, so as Francine was saying, I think it's two different things. It felt like two different things.
I don't know if I'd agree with the homegrown part, because I think and it isn't, I think she's definitely making a statement about knowledge and power when she has the colonial administrator who recognizes the different types of traditions that have come straight from West Africa and are in the Caribbean. And he's the only person who's able to kind of make those kind
Yeah,
of.
but you see, the steel band is not in this, and the steel band is in Lovelace's thing, and the steel band is a
Yeah, but
central part of Trinidad's carnival, which is, if we can argue, while it's doing the African rhythm, but it's a homegrown Trinidadian thing,
I
and
mean,
I
that's
think
it.
that's
It's based on the old drums, but it's homegrown in Trinidad. But because steel pan doesn't make it to Dominica in the 1950s, I don't think it means that their carnival is not also of its own making a fully Caribbean carnival. Because even if there's some of the traditions, and particularly the masking, is coming from directly from West Africa in the way that the characters describe, it is also adapted into a Caribbean climate, and they've been practicing carnival this way for at this stage a couple hundred years at least. So it is very much a local tradition. It's not right. It's not an imported tradition. They didn't leave Africa yesterday. Um, they've
No, no,
adapted.
no, no. So
So so
I'm agreeing with that, but I'm saying the connection to the original, the Africanness of it is certainly more obvious in the Dominica setup and what Francine was describing as the rural Grenada, or even you, Kessa, was talking about Martinique and Guadeloupe, right? That
not
close,
Guadeloupe. Carnival in Guadeloupe is a very different thing.
or
It's
Martinique, right? That
yeah.
close connection is more obvious in that than it is in Trinidad, although the festival itself has the same genesis, right?
Yeah, and then we've been talking about sort of the African heritage and how it plays out in the carnival, but we haven't spoken yet about the indigenous people of Dominica. Does this novel effectively erase Dominica's Kalinago community?
I don't mind jumping on this. I thought so a little bit actually. So we have this character Simon who is supposedly a car. He's supposed, described as a Carib, right? So it's not like they're completely absent. But she does a lot of work to bring in the language of Creole, which I'm delighted to see. Um, but she also erases that Dominica's unusual in that it has a whole other language that isn't English, Kokoi, right? And that is nowhere mentioned. It doesn't come up at all. And that feels like an erasure. But also similarly, although Simon comes from a Carib community, he's also a bit of a bad guy. He's a bit of a villain character, and he kind of is redeemed at the end. But you don't get I felt like you didn't get a strong sense of the presence of those communities in Dominica in the way that actually when you're in Dominica, they're very much present. They're not like it's a kind of feature of the Caribbean landscape in Dominica. Sorry, it's a feature of the Dominican landscape that there's these massive Carib spaces, right? And these communities in the same way that in Trinidad, you would never write a novel that didn't make any kind of reference to the fact that, like, actually the African population isn't the only people here. Do you know what I mean? It's part of that. It's a part of that place, and so it felt very like it did feel kind of erasy for me. I
But
felt like
could it could
strange.
it could it just be symptomatic of this was written 20 years ago? Because, for example, Dominica recently got their first Kalinago president. Their president is now Kalinago. There's a lot more well, to be honest, 20 years ago I was only 6, but it seems like there's a lot more prominence now. So I don't know if it's just symptomatic of the time this novel was written.
I'm wondering if it was symptomatic of the time in which the novel was placed. I mean, yes, Keswa, now if you go to Dominica, you can see, but would it have been the same back at the time that the story was written? I don't know, I'm asking.
I wonder if it's less to do with the time that it's set in and more to do with the author's own sensibilities. And this is what I mean when I think when I wonder if like it's a kind of thing that in the same way that an Afro Trinidadian would not write a book that made no reference to the Indo Trinidadian community, even if they're writing about Afro Trinidadians, it feels like the kind of thing that a foreigner could do, but a Dominican could never do. That was my kind of only explanation based on nothing, like just based on having been to Dominica a few times. But do you know what I mean? Like it didn't feel it because 20 years ago when this book was published, like Dominica's Carib communities or Kalinago communities were very present, were very much had huge spaces of land. Like they're not. This isn't a new thing. The way that we kind of talk, there's it's not new. It's very much a part of their history and their culture and their country. And so it felt absent for me as a novel about Dominica. I'm not suggesting they needed to do that. It felt like an absence. I'm not going to suggest how it could have been otherwise. It felt like an absence and an erased absence, yeah.
Not about the erasure part, but what certainly grabbed my attention and was a bit concerning for me, and it was when the Carib community, Kalinago community was being referenced. There's a lot of stereotyping going on, and I felt that was a little, the part where Carib women highly sexual and all this sort of. I didn't like. I was a little uncomfortable with that kind of stereotyping, um, and because I've lived it here in St. Vincent too, we have we have Caribs here. St. Vincent is rich in that history, um, and I've grown up with that sort of those perceptions of Carib people. It's discriminatory, to be honest, and I saw that in bits and pieces of the narrative being just you know thrown in, and I didn't like it. It made me kind of you
But to
know
me, I got the impression that, I mean, like you said, Tony, you're still aware of people who have those stereotypes. So to me, she was not stereotyping them. She was just reflecting how people felt at that time. That was the way I read it. No,
yes,
guess what?
but
It's the narrator's
I
voice. It's not someone else saying it. It's the narrator's voice. So
yeah.
I think that's where it becomes. It's different when the character says it and they're like you say reflecting, but it's also different when when it's the narration, which is supposed to be reliable.
Correct, Kessel. Correct, correct. It left me with the sense that the author was doing it, right? So I'm sorry, Francine, but um, I'm not going to forgive her there.
But then, if, if it's any consolation, I mean, she mentions the Maroons alongside the indigenous people. Did you find any similarities with Nalo Hopkinson's Black Hat Man, Olive Senior's Paradise Once, or do you have any comments on this inclusion in general?
The Maroon community, which was a big part of the actual novel itself, because we're left to believe that this is where Matilda lived, right? And this was a whole village, town, whatever, community. That was going on. I have vague recollection of the Neil Hopkinson novel, but I I didn't get a similar sense when I read the question. I didn't get a it. I didn't get a similar sense of both things being, you know, a bit of the same. Um, the Maroon community in this novel felt more contrived. I mean, I don't know if I'm I'm being too brash and harsh and a bit punishing on the author, but I just felt, you know, yeah. Let me shut up
No,
because
I think
yeah,
no,
yeah,
I actually get where you're coming from because I think in those two stories in Paradise Once and Black Hat Man, we got a very different portrayal of indigenous communities than we did in this novel, and I mean that might have just been the way that Marie-Elena John wanted to write the novel because, as you mentioned, we got all these stereotypes, um, which are widely known. But then, for example, in Black Hat Man and in Paradise Once, we the sort of magical realism that came out in those novels were more positive, if I could put it that way. So I think it was just a
absolutely,
difference in
Roger.
portrayal. Yeah.
Absolutely, Roger.
But
You described it
can
better.
we can we actually make those comparisons though? Because it's not the same context, right? Because Black Heart Man, we're not talking about people who have been colonized and who ran away and made. We're talking about people who have not. So I'm not sure that we can really compare the Maroon community in this novel with with the community in Black Heart Man or the indigenous people in Paradise Once. I don't know. To me, it feels like comparing apples and oranges. Honestly,
It may be, but I want to say to Roger's point about the what comes out positively about um, the maroon community, if you want, in Neil Hopkinson's novel, Black Hat Man, as opposed to what in Matilda's Village seemed to have been a lot of negative stuff, a lot of dark stuff, right? And I think that's why I felt, you know, a bit contrived, and stereotypical as well. You know, it's like what you read about when somebody's trying to tell you about how Africans live together. You know, it stops short of saying they used to eat one another. You know, that's the tone I got. I'm sorry. I don't know.
I'm
Paula
gonna.
is not here. She's shaking her head. I have to tell our viewers she's in the background disagreeing with me. She
Yeah,
can't express
I
herself, but
really wanna hear
yeah.
Kesoa's take on this because I
Yeah,
have some
I
thoughts.
the word contrived was so strong. I was like, "Whoo, contrived!" Tony's big and putting out big words here. And I had to think, and I was listening to the conversation, and my instinct is to disagree a little bit. I'll disagree because I think it's a different kind of novel in the first place. I think that's really important to know. This is very much like a dark, tragic novel, right? Like it's a grappling with history, but it's deliberately looking at trauma and unpleasant sides of history. So I don't think it's fair to expect it to have a positive take on a marginalized community that's a part of that story, right? Because that's not the angle that the novel's coming at the story from in the first place. But I also think the novel is really concerned with transmission. It's very concerned with like the things that make it to the Caribbean from Africa. Um, as a general sort of theme, and we see that in Carnival, but we also see it in what remains with the Maroons, right? And what practices Dominicans have when it comes to Catholicism. It's a theme it's a motif of the novel. Um, so when I think about the portrayal of the Maroon community in particular, it didn't feel super contrived because for me, I felt like we didn't see that community up close. You know, what we all we really see of it is Matilda's like moment in Carnival and how they participate and the conflict with the police. And then the way that the priest tries to engage with the elders. And so we never really see the community on its own terms, through its own eyes, or even just in a daily life kind of situation. We only really see it at these extreme moments, if you like. So it's
Yeah, that's
really hard.
correct, question. You're absolutely correct there.
Yeah,
And there lies the difference with the Neil Hopkinson
yeah,
community,
it,
because we were seeing everyday living going on there as opposed to just samples of and a sort of piecing back the historic notes of what may have happened, the speculations, right? So you're
and
right.
it's speculations. It's those
Yeah.
speculations where you see the prejudice of people. We imagine this happened, we imagine that happened. People said this, there's a song about that. But that's never supposed to be the authoritative take. And that's why I think the novel's really clever about how it reconstructs history, because that's the whole kind of pulsate. What did happen is a kind of it's really important to us. Like Lillian's well-being depends on us figuring this mystery out. But we don't have any reliable source material to work with, and that's the kind of heartbeat of the novel. And that's why I think as a historian, it's really really good. But I think as a portrayal of Maroon communities, I wouldn't say it's contrived. I'd say it's incomplete, but I don't think it tries to be complete. So I think yeah, in and of itself, the portrayal isn't a bad portrayal, if you like. I don't think.
Right. And it makes me think of the interaction that Teddy had with Bird, where Teddy came up with his, understanding of what happened, and Bird laughed and was like, is that the conclusion that you really came to? Is that your experience leads you to the fact that it had to be this certain thing, but like, is it really that? I think that kind of talks about, like Tony, you said, it's really dark and all we saw was all this darkness, but that's from our 21st century point of view. It's just similarly to Teddy, his 21st century point of view, or 20th century point of view, no, that would also be 21st century, led him to a certain conclusion as to, to explain what they found in the forest. And Bird pretty much said, well, is that really what you think happened? And I think that is our approach to it is the same, that we're thinking, oh my God, these things are just these awful, horrible, dark things. But we don't actually understand, as Kessowa said, the day-to-day life, how these people were living, whether we think the things they were doing were awful or horrible, but did they think the same? Possibly not.
Yeah, I think
And
Bird's intervention was very important in sort of balancing that. And to me, now I reflect, it was a pity. I think maybe that there wasn't a bit more of that understanding of just for me, from the reader's perspective, what I was curious about Matilda's existence, right? Very, I think, like I said at the beginning of this program, Matilda was more the protagonist for me, than Liliane. So I was very curious about her, but um, there wasn't enough of that bird um, explanation, if you want, Francine, or relating um, what was life like in that maroon.
but I
Um,
think this is about the style of the writing. I think this is a very like one of the things I loved about it. It reminded me a bit of Antoine de Gaumier in that it's very light in the writing in some ways. Like it's not. It feels like it's an easy read. It's compelling. You can go through it quickly, but there are big, heavy questions being asked. The sentences are dense with thoughts and ideas. And if it's not a book to skim. You'll miss too much. It's really there's a lot happening, and that conversation with Bird is so important because it's a point at which we see that Mary Ellis's own version, and we haven't talked about Mary Alice, right? This character who has essentially got this woman convicted and killed because she didn't understand the story that she was hearing. She couldn't put the cultural context into what she was seeing, and therefore this other person died.
by the way, guess what? Another stereotype, Mario. Let's get in the back of a strong black man, and then all of a sudden, religion goes out of the window.
Tony, I thought of you
Uh,
immediately when I
I'm
read that.
saying,
I
all
said,
right,
I know
right. White
Tony
woman
is
comes to the
going
Caribbean, and
to
what a
grant for
stereotype.
this. Yep,
There
I
we
thought
go.
about you. I was like, Tony is not going to like
Yeah,
this at all, and I was correct.
there we go.
I mean, maybe. I'm sorry my writing's doing crazy
I know,
things.
but I mean, it happens, right?
No,
It happens, but I'm a black man, and I sometimes take offense to it. I have to tell
I
you,
know you
right?
do. I know you do.
This idea that white women only engage with black men because of what's dangling between their legs. I'm sorry for the viewers to be so graphic, but I got this
But no,
anyway.
no, but Tony,
more to
that is
it.
Yeah.
what that is what people thought. People thought that it was that, and she kept trying to explain to them, no, I could
No,
feel
I know
his
Mary Alice
essence.
was is in love with this man, and it wasn't that, but it's the anyway. All right.
But also, I think there's also something in this about the fact that Bird was a part of this community that Matilda came from and had managed to keep, and yet they had completely different lives despite being a partnership. I thought that was super interesting. Like, how has he kept this secret for so long from the woman that he lives with and has all these grandchildren and children with? Like, what is this saying about love, right? That this woman's ready to take a cutlass to this other woman for this man in a moment of like what is that can only be described as humiliation, right? You can tell that she's lowered herself to the point of like, all of her white privilege is out the window now. She's just like any other woman, taking a cutlass to a man like all the other Dominicans. Took taking
Let
a
me
cutlass. To a man.
Yeah,
But yeah,
sorry, guys. But let me just say this, because you're all you're looking at the time. Let me just try to redeem myself a little bit here, right? It's not. I have no problem with Mary Alice. Mary Alice is her name, and Bud. I have no problem with their relationship. You know what I have the problem with? The problem is how they met. I have the problem with the carrying on the back and the physical part. That's my sticking point. Paula, nod your head as much as you want. Um,
but that's not about
that
him.
is
It's
my
about her.
sticking point,
That's all about her. That's
right?
nothing to do with
But
So,
him.
so
right,
yeah,
because
the relationship is fine.
because
Yeah.
she had
Mm.
basically she had never had a sexual awakening because she went into she became a nun very young. She never had a sexual awakening. And it wasn't so much about the fact that it was a white woman and a black man. It was more the fact that there's this virgin nun who, for the first time, had feelings,
I
right?
agree. I don't think it's about him and his sexuality. It's very much about actually her lack thereof of sexuality and how it enters her life quite suddenly. I really want to ask this question about Actually, there's a lot of questions I still want to ask. How do we feel about the ethics of this novel? Just overarching.
In
So,
what sense?
well, I one of the ways of reading this novel, because the ending is the ending is ambiguous theoretically, right? You can read it one way, you can read it another way. She deliberately leaves it a little bit open to interpretation. Um, but one of those options I think is a real kind of reaching into history for the stories of Africans who refused enslavement and chose death, right? And applying it into the present day. I think the novel's ending is really ambiguous. But even if it isn't ambiguous, I struggle with the ethics of publishing a novel where suicide is cited as a possible happy ending. I wonder about the ethics of that. Like having, yeah, and I wonder if anybody else has that. And whose
But
thoughts?
why? But why? I mean, why are you assuming a happy ending? To me, there's no happy ending, so I don't see any issue.
All right, I have a last question then that I'll ask. That is not a difficult one, hopefully, or is maybe a conversation starter. Is a single trip back to the Caribbean to Dominica the undoing of both Teddy and Lillian, and if so, why? Like, how do we feel about that as a plot device?
Undoing of them individually or undoing of them as a okay. Hmm.
Well, I don't know about undoing. It's a re-education for Teddy, or it's an awareness. I mean, this is a guy who is on the Washington scene. I mean, earlier on, you all were discussing his character, but poor guy, it's the culture of the place. You know, you're a professional. You're trying to go up the ladder, the professional ladder in this instance, and then there's certain traits that go with that, and some of it is arrogance, and you know he manages on CNN and all this sort of thing, and then he goes to Dominica, and in unearthing Lillian's story, he kind of sees what earthy living is all about, and kind of understand the nuances of people who are steeped in a real culture, um, you know, in a soulful culture. I don't have the words, but certainly not Washington, right? Certainly not the cosmopolitan type of thing where you're just a statistic. Your life counts and has meaning to everybody else. Okay, and that was Teddy's education. You
Right,
know,
because at one point the author did make the point, I think it was Lillian who was thinking this, that Teddy was very good at analyzing issues and coming up with, okay, this is what this means, but then he was not at all good at putting anything in motion to like fix problems. And so maybe Dominica was not necessarily his undoing, but maybe it got him to the point where he could go beyond the theoretical and actually, you know, do things in a more practical manner. I don't know. It was definitely, I would say it was definitely the undoing of Lydian, though. Um, I think, yeah.
And this might be unrelated to the question, Kesua, but I think Teddy's situation reminded me of the disclaimer that you and Eric always give, where that's not the type of history that I specialize in, because he specialized in African American history, right? But then he goes to Dominica and he learns this entire dimension that is completely different for the Afro descended people, and he learns about the indigenous people there as well, which would also be very different to the indigenous story in the United States. So I just wanted to add that I got that that different dimension.
I think it's and it is kind of the undoing though, because he's not sure of himself anymore. And we see that even before he leaves. Like that very nice last night in Dominique in Washington D.C., he goes to this place where he knows he'll meet people from all over the world, right? But all of African heritage, so different parts of the Caribbean, different parts of Africa, migrants. He's going to be out of place as an African American, even on American soil at that point. And he's going to be cool and he's going to enjoy himself. But towards the end of the night, his own desperation kind of is revealed, right? He's like, please, can you tell me what happened to this random person that he's met once or twice before? And similarly, when he gets to Dominica, he's consistently disarmed. He's consistently finding that he has to do things differently. He's not comfortable. People ignore him. He's not important anymore. And there's and the last time we see Teddy, which isn't a spoiler, I hope, but he's described as running like a child, like all of the kind of pretense and whatever is gone, and he's just a man desperately hoping for a thing that, in a way, that's almost childlike. His dignity is out of the window. And for me, that was kind of a continuing, and for Lillian, we see that most obviously she's kind of through the eyes of Teddy, we're seeing him understanding her to be having some kind of mental breakdown as they arrive in Dominica, and it kind of intensifies, even though it feels like she's having an increasing understanding of her own mental health, and she's actually getting stronger, not weaker. But there's this kind of sense of an irresistible pull that's negative and maybe evil, um, that is going to take her into a sort of darker place. So it does feel like, but so it feels like this trip has taken them to a completely different place to where they were from when they started, in a way that we normally enjoy that kind of hero's journey arc, right? But in this case, I don't know how I feel like. I mean, again, it comes back to this question of ethics, but like, is it okay that merely landing on Dominican soil with a question is gonna like unend you and disrupt you in a way that like maybe you'll never be the same again? But not. I guess I guess the question is it a positive? Because it doesn't feel never like it feels like Teddy might be a better person at the end of it, and that might be okay. But Lillian feels like she's going to be broken, perhaps. Like, and I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I think that's why I would put the question. I'm like, what is that? What does that mean? Is that okay? Do we feel okay about it? How do we feel about it? Am I the person that read it in that depth?
I mean, we could go on for hours discussing this novel, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you to our viewers for joining us. Have a lovely day.